Australia has finally won the Border-Gavaskar Trophy after the last 10 years. It's weird to think, but Pat Cummins had never actually won this trophy. In fact, his comeback was right back at the start when Australia started losing to India all the time. And the rest of the senior corps, they had won once, but right at the start, and then they had to get used to losing over and over again. A decade without winning for a team that was winning quite a bit against everyone else. And of course, it was often made much worse because these were the two best teams. But for this corps, and specifically for Cummins, this was an absolutely huge win because of everything that had come before it. They gave up chances to win. They lost 2 players because of building supplies. They had a massive collapse in the 3rd innings. They completely screwed up on a wicket that they should have been very suited to. India had been beating Australia for a very long time until now.
A few years ago, I realised that trying to find the best stories in cricket was impossible for any fan. I even tried to get funding to make my own cricket Huffington Post. It never quite worked. But luckily, we finally have someone filling this massive void in our game. Best of Cricket. They scour the publications everywhere to find, quite simply, all the best news and the greatest stories on our sport. But then they make it just as easy. They either email it or WhatsApp it direct to you. Cricket's greatest tales delivered to your device. This is truly the best of cricket.
All right. So obviously Australia won in 2014 with quite a lot of this core, even if they didn't have Cummins at that time. But 2017 is where all this starts. It's also weirdly where Cummins makes his comeback to Test cricket. And I suppose it's not even his comeback. It's like basically his beginning, but he had a little flirt with Test cricket. Then we didn't see him for about 4 prime ministers, and then he came back. That series started with an hilarious one where the Australian team was bitching and moaning about how the wicket was against them and how they were really going to struggle. And then they went and won the Test match on the back of an incredible 100 by Steve Smith and Steve O'Keefe taking just a lot of wickets. They then went to Bengaluru and Nathan Lyon took a bunch of wickets here, like an 8-wicket haul, but they still actually managed to lose that game, partly just because India did outplay them. They got to Ranchi, they made a lot of runs in the 1st innings, but it was a very flat wicket, and they ended up having to hang on a little bit on day 5 in what could have been quite a dangerous one. They finally got to Dharamshala with the series at 1-1 and a huge chance of winning on probably one of the best wickets they're ever going to bowl on in India, and it was the Indian seamers who outbowled the Australian ones. At that time, it didn't matter that much because they'd only just lost that one series, but that was probably their big missed opportunity. From here, we come down to 1819. For that Adelaide Test, they had one of the more remarkable batting orders that you'll ever see. They had Aaron Finch, Marcus Harris, Shaun Marsh, and Peter Handscomb. It's not exactly household names when it comes to Test cricket, is it? However, they only lost by 31 runs in that game, and realistically, looking back, they had plenty of chances to win. They did actually win the next one, meaning that it was 1-1 after Perth. So they had a really good chance with 2 tests to go. That was until they were smashed everywhere at the MCG, and when they got to the SCG, India made over 600 in the 1st innings to basically seal the draw at that stage. So they had a huge chance after the first 2, and then pretty much nothing at all when it comes to the last. But there is something worth remembering about this series. This is probably what is now known in some places as the Asterisk series. Because, of course, they did not have Steve Smith, and they did not have David Warner because of the sandpaper incidents. And that's why they had that weird, funky batting lineup at the start of the series. They were trying to find batting anywhere they could. And essentially, India was just a better side than them at that point. There's another home series straight after in 2021. With 2 losses on the trot to India at this stage, I think Australia was a bit more fired up about playing India. And when they got to Adelaide, of course, this is probably the first test we ever saw the reinforced Kookaburra seam. And India didn't see much of it because they were bowled out for 36 and that one was over. At that stage, it looked like the entire series was over. And it's incredible looking back because Australia's opening batting at that stage was Matthew Wade and Joe Burns. This was not a stable Australian team. In Melbourne, India came back with a really, really good victory on the back of Ajinkya Rahane, which annoyed a lot of people who didn't like Ajinkya Rahane. Then in Sydney, Australia had the better of the game, but that 4th innings from India was really something quite special, and they made a lot of runs looking back on it, and Rishabh Pant's knock especially changed things a lot. But this is mostly remembered for the Ashwin and Bahari partnership at the end when they were sharing body armour and Ashwin couldn't move, and of course the famous thing of wait till we get you to the Gabba. Well, they went to the Gabba, and to be fair, Australia played pretty good cricket, got themselves ahead all the way through at the Gabba. But unfortunately, India did an incredible chase at the end, over 300, Rishabh Pant again, and India had won a test and the entire series with essentially net bowlers and backups and without their stars. It was one of the most incredible wins of modern cricket history. But one of the reasons it was so incredible is it's not very often that the home team goes 1-0 up and still manages to lose the series, especially when they had the best of probably the last two test matches as well. Like, Australia could have won that series 3-1 and ended up losing the entire series. Incredible effort from India. But you can imagine at that point, Australia's like, what the hell is going on? India was in the middle of their invincible phase, right? And the wickets were getting more and more treacherous for opposition batters. No one was expecting to make any runs. And in the first test, that's kind of what happened. The Australians weren't even really in that game at all. They lost by more than innings. The Delhi one is more interesting because this could have changed the series quite a lot. After the first innings, they basically played out a stalemate. This was a second innings shootout, and all Australia had to do was make a few runs. Australia made no runs. Even a decent total there, and I reckon they might have got over the line. But in the middle of all that, while India is dominating them, they come back and they win at Indore. And this was maybe one of the first signs, although, coming back to the Pune one, of India just making the wickets so variable that an opposition team could come in and steal one. And Australia played really well in that final match, but unfortunately, it was such a flat wicket and there was no way that they were going to be able to get a result in that. So they ended up with an honourable 2-1 loss. Now, I think in 2017, they deserved more than 2-1. And in 2023, they were probably happy with 2-1. But you can only ever be so happy to keep losing to the same team over and over and over again, right? After that, they got to play them in the World Test Championship. This is quite an interesting match now, all things considered, because it's really upset India that they've lost twice. India haven't had a World Test Championship in conditions that have suited them yet. And they were probably the first major team to really focus in on the World Test Championship. And yet Australia came from nowhere, played some really good cricket and outwitted them there. But that isn't the only time that Australia has beaten India, because of course, in the World Cup that same year, India were absolutely dominant all the way through. They got to the final. Australia came up with some good tactics, but India also really shit the bed there. And suddenly Australia had won twice. So you have this weird situation where this entire core has been losing to India all the way through, but then when there were trophies on offer, they picked up two of them. And remember, at this period, India absolutely dominated all bilateral cricket, but the minute you put a trophy in front of them, they would lose. But there's absolutely no doubt with the age of this core and the fact that you've already had some retirements like David Warner, that it meant a lot to Australia to beat India. But not just beat India, specifically, I think, hold the fort at home. I think they can accept some of these losses because India has been so good in India and they've still managed to win a couple of test matches. I'm not sure they can quite accept these. They had more than a few opportunities to win in both of these series, and India played brilliantly. They wouldn't take that away from them, but they would be annoyed by that. What's more remarkable by the day is that Perth test match, right? Where Australia came in seemingly with all the momentum and New Zealand had just beaten India at home. And then India don't steal the test match. They smash the test match, right? That was such a dominant game. We always thought there'd be a bit of a comeback in the next game with the pink ball game being in Adelaide, but it still meant that we were 1-1 at that stage. Then Australia continued to dominate at the Gabba when they weren't being drowned out by the rain. But if you think back to the end of that Gabba test, India had actually got themselves into a position to be able to steal that match from nowhere. If it hadn't rained on the final day, that could have been an incredible game. But either way, no one got the result there. And at the SCG at T on day 5, you would have said that we were going to get the same thing. Australia had dominated. India had got themselves back into a decent position, maybe not to win the game, but at least to put some pressure on Australia. And it was very unlikely that Australia were going to win with 7 wickets required. But that's exactly what happened. And that's the sort of thing, if you look at the rest of all these series that hadn't been happening before. Australia had put themselves in positions to win in other test matches before, but they hadn't actually gone on to win them when they needed to. That MCG test was the difference. And then we get to the SCG, and we get a very different SCG than we had last time. Or either of these two times. In fact, this SCG is like nothing I had ever seen before. And this is an absolute arm wrestle test. And just at the point when the hands are at their sweatiest in the arm wrestle, what happens? Jasprit Bumrah gets injured. Maybe Australia still win this test match, even if he doesn't. But it certainly made it a lot easier. And if you look all the way through this, there was many times when Australia could have drawn a series or even gone on to win a series, but something went against them. But this time, it was all about the things that went wrong for India. Shami never even got in the country, let alone on the field. We saw snippets and highlights of him bowling, but he was never more than a dream to this series. Bumrah got all the way through the series, and when there was a chance of stealing a draw at the end, that's when his body finally gave through. He basically gave everything he had, and there was nothing left of him. Virat and Rohit. Smith made 200s, which was more than these two did combined. By the end of the series, Rohit wasn't even in the team anymore. I mean, at the start of the series, he wasn't in the team anymore. Virat was there the whole time, more in spirit than in runs. And what about India and 4 seamers? They never went in with a lineup of 4 frontline seamers at any stage. Now, to be fair, neither did Australia, and they still did pretty well. And perhaps the main difference here was Boland. Because Australia lost Josh Hazlewood, who really only played, a test and a half in this series. And it didn't matter because of what Scott Boland did. He was probably the second best bowler in the series after Bumrah, and he was Australia's 4th choice seamer. India used 5 frontline seamers all the way through, and they really never got anything out of their 3rd seamer position. Australia whipped Boland in, and it was completely different. This whole board is full of moments where things just didn't go quite right for Australia. And then you come to this one, and you get a whole list of things that didn't go quite right for India. All things considered, there really isn't that much between these two teams over the last decade. And so there is no doubt that Australia definitely deserved to win at least one Border-Gavaskar Trophy.
It took God and the demon to build international cricket, but don't tell Johnny Best that. 1882, Australia had played 1 test in England against the god W.G. Grace, and they sucked. So they were playing him again, and it was a tough wicket. But England was in front, so Australia was desperate for a 3rd innings lead. At number 8 was young all-rounder Sammy Jones. After a routine single, he walks down to do some gardening on the pitch. Grace whips off the bails and appeals. The ball wasn't dead, Jones was run out. The Australians were furious. In fact, some of the English players were also furious. But what Grace said went, and the umpires had already given it. Next in was Fred Spofforth. He was known as the Demon fast bowler. He was furious, and he let England know exactly what was coming next, which was maiden. There's 12 maidens. I can't count them all. England only needed 85 to win. W.G. Grace made 32. England only 77. That was the test where the Ashes began. Buy my book, Overthrowing Cricket's Empire, on Amazon today.